This is the chapter where the Watchers broke their own rules. Not because Russia was fake. Not because the FBI had no reason to worry. But because a real counterintelligence threat was pursued through a broken surveillance process. And once that happened, the people trusted to protect the system helped damage trust in the system itself. That is Chapter 7. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else in this series. Because if you get this chapter wrong, you walk away with the wrong lesson. This is not the chapter that proves the whole Russia story was invented. And it is not the chapter that lets the system off the hook because the threat was real. It is the chapter that forces two uncomfortable truths to live in the same room. Russia was a real counterintelligence concern. And the Carter Page FISA process was deeply flawed. That is the hook. And that is why this chapter still lands like a hammer. Here is the part too many people still get wrong. The opening of the investigation and the Carter Page FISA file are not the same story. They are connected. But they are not identical. And too many people still collapse them into one slogan because slogans are easier than structure. But structure is exactly what this chapter demands. The FBI had an authorized basis to open Crossfire Hurricane. That matters. It matters because Russia was not a fantasy. The threat did not appear out of nowhere. The concern was not pulled from thin air. There was a real national security problem in the background, and the Bureau was not wrong to recognize that. That is the first truth. But then comes the second. Once the government moved into the Carter Page FISA process, the system began to break. And this is where the chapter turns dark. Because FISA is not an ordinary courtroom fight. It is not a public trial with two sides in balance before a jury. It is secret. It is one-sided by design. The target is not there to defend himself. The court depends on the government to be complete, accurate, and candid. That means the government's duty is not lower there. It is higher. And that is exactly why the failures here matter so much. The Carter Page file became a place where omissions, inaccuracies, and unsupported claims accumulated inside one of the most sensitive surveillance tools the government has. That is not a technical footnote. That is the scandal. Because once the government asks for secret power in a secret court, the public has only one real protection, that the people inside the system follow the rules with extreme care. And in this case, they did not. That is the scandal inside the scandal. Not just that mistakes were made, but that the mistakes were made in a setting where trust is the safeguard. And when trust fails there, the damage spreads fast. This is where people usually run toward their favorite simplifications. One side wants to say this proves the whole Russia investigation was fake. The other side wants to say the process failures barely matter because Russia was a real threat. Both reactions miss the force of the chapter. A real threat does not excuse a broken process. And a broken process does not erase a real threat. That tension is the point. Once you hold both truths together, the story gets much sharper. Because then the question is no longer, was the FBI allowed to care? The question becomes, what happened when the FBI and DOJ asked for surveillance power and failed to meet the duty that power required? That is a much harder question. And it cuts deeper. Because the failures were not abstract. They moved through documents, renewals, omissions, assertions, and judgment calls. They became part of a chain. And that chain lasted long enough to poison public trust. Then the story gets a human face. Kevin Clinesmith. Because large institutional failures often become real to the public only when one human act crystallizes everything. And here, the altered email did exactly that. It turned a sprawling argument about process integrity into something concrete enough for anyone to understand. A line was changed. Meaning was altered. And in a surveillance process where precision is supposed to be sacred, that kind of misconduct is devastating. That does not mean Clinesmith explains everything. He does not. But he gives the chapter a focal point. He shows that this was not only about fog, complexity, and bureaucratic drift. It was also about human choice inside a process already under an extreme duty to tell the truth. And once that happens, the damage is no longer containable. Because then the public starts asking the question that governments fear most. If candor failed here, where else did candor fail? That is why this chapter became so politically explosive. Not only because of Carter Page. Not only because of Trump. Not only because of Russia. But because it touched one of the oldest fears in democratic life. What happens when surveillance power escapes the discipline that is supposed to contain it? That fear is bigger than this case. And that is why this case still matters. People heard FISA, Russia, and Trump and immediately sorted themselves into teams. But this chapter should do the opposite. It should make everyone more serious. Because if you care about democracy, then you should care about both parts of this story. You should care that foreign interference was real. And you should care that the machinery built to respond to dangerous threats was mishandled in ways that damaged its own legitimacy. That is why this chapter is colder than a simple partisan scandal. It is about a system that may have been pointed at a real danger and still failed the standards that justified its power. That is the wound. And that is why this chapter still matters. Once candor fails inside secret surveillance, public trust starts bleeding out. So if the world asks what Chapter 7 really proves, the answer is this: the FBI had a basis to open the investigation. Russia was a real counterintelligence concern. But the Carter Page FISA process was deeply flawed. The secret court depended on government candor. That candor broke down. And once it broke down, broken process became its own scandal. That is the payoff. This chapter does not prove the whole Russia story was fake. It proves something colder. A real danger was pursued badly enough to wound the legitimacy of the people pursuing it. And the next chapter takes us into another corridor of influence: Petra Avin, Richard Burt, Project A. Because power does not always move through a public scandal. Sometimes it moves through oligarch channels, elite access, and quiet pressure around the edges of American politics. That is where the story goes next. The parent, the teacher, the nurse, our mission. Big hugs. Big Dave. Support democracy by supporting Ukraine directly through United 24 media, links in description. Subscribe not to miss our weekly deep dive into Russia. Trump 15 in total, 1K in videos for your interest.